Hi, this is Mandy de Waal, and I'm with Andrew Miller today. Andrew Miller is an award-winning author. He's been a long-time friend of mine and is a man who has now become one of the gods of writing. Unlike us mere mortals who are still unpublished, he has published a novel called Dubsteps, and more so, his first novel has won an award, and quite a significant award. Tell us about that award, Andrew. How did you enter, and what is that award all about?
Well, it's the Dinaane Award for Debut Fiction, and it used to be the EU Literary Award. And so, I mean, I just printed off a couple of copies of the book and dumped it at Jacana, because they're the ones who run the award, and then kind of thought nothing of it because I didn't expect a hell of a lot. And then I ended up winning it. It was amazingly, weirdly sort of simple. Yeah.
Tell me about the part that's not simple. And the part that's not simple, of course, is the writing of the book. Kind of when did that all start, and when did the idea come about? And the struggle.
I wrote it over about a 6 or 7 year period, But yeah, when you say that, then it sounds like you've been sitting at your desk for 6 or 7 years, and it's not like that at all. I had an idea, just a simple idea, which I pursued. And then I wrote the first draft over a 2 or 3 year period, and literally just doing an hour before work every day before I left for the office. And then I had a draft, and then it took another 3 years of messing around with the draft until I had something I was happy with. And the version I sent to the award is the award is the only place I sent this version to. Yeah. So 6 or 7 years. And in the process, I guess you kind of lose hope about everything because there's no feedback loop to engage with. So there's nothing to tell you that you're doing a good thing. In your own mind, it's probably a terrible thing, And so I think that's the challenge for all writers writing longer form, is that you don't really know what you're doing and whether it has any depth to it, So over 6 years, you start to doubt yourself quite a lot. Yeah, I think that's the big challenge.
And where you started out and where you ended up, how different is the book kind of in concept and in form, kind of, from the beginning as, to the end? How much has the book changed as you've gone along?
Completely, because I never had a plot. All I had was an idea. I had two things, an idea about a guy waking up in Joburg and everyone's gone, including pets and livestock. So I really liked that just as a device, And then I also had an idea about how important human relationships are, especially in a digital world where we seem to really struggle with face-to-face, And so I just sat down and wrote around the idea of this guy waking up. And it took maybe 5 or 6 months to figure out a storyline that would kind of work. And when I'd figured out a plot line that would work, I ditched the first 30,000 words that I'd written, and I kind of started again. And then I had a story. Yeah. So I had to discover the story by actually sitting down and trying to pursue this idea of a guy waking up and there's no one around. Yeah.
Now, you've called the book Dubsteps. What is dub? Tell me about Dubsteps and dub. What is it, and what is your connection?
Well, dub is an interesting thing because a dub is that thing that happened in the 60s in Jamaica, where King Tubby and Lee Scratch and people like that started messing with music, messing with the literal tapes of music, and starting to create this thing of echo and reverb that we now know as the kind of whole dance milieu, the doof thing, using lots of repetition and basically taking songs, deconstructing them completely, and then emphasizing the bass line and creating that kind of that Jamaican groove, And so, in my view, dub is one of the pivotal evolutionary moments in music, So now the DJs just twiddle a knob and they get the echo and reverb. But in the original days, someone did that. Someone actually played with the musical tape and created these devices. And so for me, dub is like a metaphor, an evolutionary metaphor, And because there's so much music in the character and the book, it kind of and there is dub music, and there's a long-running kind of little debate amongst the characters as to which is the best genre of dub. Then Dubsteps seems to me to be a nice title, you know. Yeah, but I'm really interested in the idea of evolution and how things change, you know. Yeah.
Now, what you tell me about dub is quite interesting, because what you say, there's a political element, of course, about what you're saying, because David Guetta and Skrillex,
Yes.
they're a long way from Kingston.
Yeah, long way, long way, you know. Yeah. And I mean, things, yeah, I mean, I think that's, I don't know, I think in the time that I wrote the book, I was really interested in the idea of evolution from all aspects, you know. And I think when you trace dub and how dub has influenced the world musically, culturally, it's a fascinating thing. And of course, we end up with dubstep, which is a sub genre and sounds to me almost nothing like dub, you know. But here we are with this kind of new generation of kids going off on dubstep, which is structurally different, aesthetically different. Yeah, it really interests me how things jump and change in an evolutionary sense. And I think evolution applies to culture and music as much as it does to chimpanzees and humans and stuff. Yeah.
Speak to me about relationships. Why do relationships fascinate you?
I spent 10 years working in an office where Robin, my wife, and I, we were the only white people. And we still can't speak indigenous language in this country. So it was the most interesting thing about those 10 years for me in the city was that I was being carried along every day by all of the people in the office on a language and a culture level. And it was so interesting to me how much I needed them to carry me, and then also the grace and the humor with which people carried me. And so it really made me think over that time period about how important human relationships are, you know. And then I just had this idea, I wonder what it would be like to live in a world where human relationships were the primary currency, were the most valuable thing, and all the things we value today were irrelevant. How would we cope in a world where you had to actually foster and use human relationships to survive? And of course, the main character in the book is just pitifully useless at all of that. He is an indulgent narcissist, you know. And so it was interesting for me to watch the character to develop and see his challenges with human relationships. And of course, in the South African context with language and culture and race and all those kinds of things.
So now you start with promoting the book, which is, of course, the different thing, a different animal. The writing is one thing and the editing is one thing. But now you go out and meet people, and the book marketing world, the world of marketing books and the festivals, and how you politicized in South Africa. What's your take on all of this? How do you read what's going on?
I think it's about fucking time, you know. I mean, it seems extraordinary to me that it took 20 years for us to get here and start having these conversations, you know. And I think also, I don't know, it's weird. I think Joburg corrupts you, or you start to think that Joburg's the world, you know, because when you go out in the city and stuff, it's to spoken word sessions and the hip hop scene. It's very progressive. It's very multiracial. It's very polemic. People say hectic shit. It's right there in your face, and everyone really engages on that level, and you forget that in the rest of South Africa, this may not exist, you know. So I think it's extraordinary that we're having literary festivals, Grahamstown festivals, all these kinds of things in the way that we are at the moment, you know. And I think the debate, it may be emotional for some people and it may be a little bit hectic, but it's time we started talking about history, race, violence, all these kinds of things in the realm of literature, because once we start having these conversations, we can really start to move on and move into what I think is going to be a brilliant and really exciting new century of creative writing, poetry, novels. I think it's coming. I think we're going to start to produce really great stuff. But we need to do the hard work first, you know. We need to start to talk about the things we weren't able to talk about 20 years ago with the TRC and all of that. So I think it's great. I think it's time. And I think it's particularly time that festival organizers got used to the idea that they're going to have to work much harder, you know, to do what they would like to do. Yeah.
Let's return, if we can, for a bit to the writing. When did you start writing, and kind of what has writing meant to you?
I started, yeah, I've got this muscle disease. So I started writing when the muscle disease started to kick in, and I started to experience the physical symptoms of immobility, you know. And I guess it was at a young age, and so there was a lot of emotion to try and process. And poetry was probably the easiest way for me to churn through what I was feeling, or try and understand intellectually what I was feeling. So that was around 15, 16, 17. But really, all I was doing was cannibalizing song lyrics from people's songs, you know, and writing them down and changing a few words in my bookie, you know. And then later, I started writing seriously when I was about 20. Yeah. It's everything to me. I mean, it's the way I perceive the world. It's the way I earn a living. It's everything. And I guess the trick over the years has obviously been to find some way to detach myself from what I do, and not make it also important in my own sense of self. Yeah.
Now, tell me, is it possible to make a living out of writing? Can you make a good living out of writing? And how does one go about setting that up?
Well, you need to be a bit of a whore, really. I mean, there's no ways you're going to do it without being a slut, you know, not in South Africa. Like, given how small our publishing sector is, I think the idea, like, I grew up with a very romantic idea of sitting in my room writing books, you know, and then they go out and the money dribbles in from above. But I think those days are long gone, you know. So if you want to earn a living as a writer, you probably need to investigate journalism, you need to investigate the social media space, you need to investigate public speaking, you need to figure out, and then of course corporate writing, ghostwriting, all this kind of stuff. You need to figure out, I believe, how you're going to set up 2 or 3 different revenue streams from writing that will reinforce each other in a kind of a positive cycle. If you can do that, then you've got a shot at it, you know. But it's quite an unnerving thing, because I think most writers would prefer not to ever leave the house, you know. So the imperative to actually go out there and mix it in the world is tough if you're a natural writer and a natural recluse. You know, I think that's the challenge you have to face. Yeah.
And how do you become a good writer or a better writer? How do you kind of hone your craft?
I always say I've got this friend Voyo who I've worked with for years, and we've always had this discussion. And my philosophy is that you need to learn how to wash the dishes every morning at the same time, so that you've got some kind of structure in your life. You know, so for me, that was always the challenge: is not the writing, but how am I going to organize my life so that I write at the same time for the same duration every day? You know, because if you can get that in, then you can produce 100,000 words in 6 months if you're writing 2 hours a day, as long as you're doing those 2 hours every day. And for me, in order to do the 2 hours, I have to make sure I've washed the dishes, brushed my teeth, done my exercises, earned some money, all that kind of stuff. If I can get that structure in a repeatable format every day, then I can plug the writing bit in. And the writing takes care of itself, you know. So I think the challenge is always your life. You know, how are you going to pay the rent? You know, how are you going to buy petrol? All that kind of stuff. If you can find a structure for your life where you can structure 2 hours of writing time, you will have a book, you know. Yeah, that's what I think. Yeah.
So what you're talking about is almost rote discipline, you know, like the rote discipline of carving out.
Yeah.
There's nothing creative about it, you know, it's kind of rote, vulgar discipline.
Yeah, because I think like, if you're in the position where you're starting to write a book, you are creative. You know, like, that kind of stuff is already taken care of. The difficulty, if you want to write a novel, is that you need, like, metaphorically, you need a lump of clay before you can make a pot. So creating 100,000 words, a lump of clay, is an arduous, kind of time-consuming thing, you know. If you get 100,000 words, you can be guaranteed, no matter which perspective you're coming from, your creativity is going to shine through. The difficulty is creating 100,000 words. It's not an easy thing to do within the paradigm of our life, you know. Yeah, I don't think creativity has really got anything to do with it, because I think the creativity is innate if you're a writer, and that applies whether you write for You Magazine or Vanity Fair. there's a space for you and your kind of creativity in the world if you can create those 100,000 words. But to do that, that's like going to gym every day, you know, and it's not necessarily going to be pleasant. Yeah.
So how do you know if you've got a good idea or if you've got an idea that's worthy of a novel?
I don't know, you know, and so this book, I sent to a few people, a couple of people. Robin, my wife, said she loved it. I sent it to you. I never got feedback from you. I never got feedback from someone else. One of my best colleagues, Kagiso, I mean, I gave it to him to read, and his feedback literally was, your next book's going to be brilliant. You know? So it's very difficult, you know, because and what you realize at the end of that is that it's actually very difficult to engage with someone around a book. And it's not the same as giving a friend a book and asking them to read it. There's a whole lot of other things that go on. And so to judge whether your idea is good or not, it's very difficult. And I think you can only really tell once you've created the thing. So the tendency with writers and poets and that is to judge yourself as you go, you know. And I think that's a big trap. You have to kind of, I think, just plug yourself into the process and then trust that you're a creative and you'll create something interesting if you can stick at it long enough.
Tell me about some terrible times. Were there any times that you were kind of almost lying, crying on the floor, that you felt kind of, oh my God, I can't do this anymore?
I went for a meeting with a publisher who shall remain nameless. And the publisher said to me, we don't publish fiction. We only publish a couple of books because it would be bizarre if we didn't. And so we would never be interested in publishing you unless you could get a radio show or something, in which case we would be very interested. And so for me, what the publisher was saying was that we look for celebrity first and tech second in South Africa. If we can find a rugby player or a radio personality or whatever, we'll publish. You know, because there's a commercial juggernaut behind them that we know we can cash in on. And that for me, I thought, oh shit, I'm actually in the wrong business, you know, because I'm not going to go get a radio show and I'm not going to take up rugby at this late age, you know. So that was the most difficult thing for me, is just processing the fact that even if I did write a good book, it may not be wanted in this market. Yeah. And I think that's the only time where I've thought, oh, maybe this is not such a great idea. You know, maybe I should take up a different hobby. Yeah.
And is it worth it? I mean, is it worth it? You never had your book published, or is the journey worth it?
Yeah, I think it is, but I think you have to be very careful about this kind of glorious end destination. I mean, I think for me, the spoken word stuff, performing, writing poems and stuff like that has been just as worth it, even though there's no book at the end of the road, you know. Yeah, so it is worth it, but I think you have to be careful to enjoy it along the way. You know, it's a tremendous honor, I think, to be able to get on stage and torture people with your poems and all that kind of crap as well. So we take it for granted because we think, oh, it's just, you know, it's just, now you get used to it, it's what you do, you know. But I think if you can learn to enjoy all the moments when you do little bits of journalism, or where you do a particularly good piece of ghost spin for some brand or something, that's got value too, you know. And if you can learn to enjoy the moments along the way, then it's definitely worth it. If you only want that thing, that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, then of course you're setting yourself up to maybe never get it, you know. Yeah, so I think it did, for me, it's been absolutely worth it. But I've had to pay quite careful attention to making sure I enjoy it along the way, you know. Yeah, because the book may never be published. Yeah.
And what is your advice to people who are starting out?
I said to myself when I was starting out that all I want is to write for a living. And that's exactly what ended up happening. And I ended up writing about nappies and hamburgers, you know. So I think you have to be careful to be clear when you're young, you know. Yeah, you want to write for a living, but what do you want to write? You need to think about that. I just thought it would be so wonderful and wild to write for a living that I didn't really bother what kind of writing. And so I guess I ended up spending maybe 10 years too many in the kind of corporate beast belly, you know. So I would say when you're young, be brave, you know, be brave enough to decide what you would like to do in your own mind. Because if you make those decisions when you're 20 and you're very clear about it, that will come about. If you're all fuzzy about it and you're like, oh, I would just love to write anything, you're going to end up writing about headache pills, you know, which will not be that rewarding over the long term. So I would say be brave when you're young. Be brave enough to think about what you would really, really like to write. Yeah, and then it will take shape.
Before we go, one last question. Tell us a bit about Dubsteps and why you think people should be reading Dubsteps.
I don't know. From my perspective, I just wrote a book that I think my people would like. So people who try not to work, people who listen to dance music and hip hop, people who are kind of in that part of South African society that doesn't seem to ever get a voice in the world of literature and all this kind of stuff. So I just wrote something fun, you know, something with a story and where the polemic or the metaphorical kind of content and stuff is sitting quite well below the surface, you know. So I just wrote something that I hoped people would want to turn the page for a change in South Africa, and where the politics and the kind of all that kind of stuff can sit below the surface. Yeah. So I think if you're into something that is kind of young in its identity and tries not to be too serious, then it could be entertaining.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Lekker.